The American Sunbelt is one of those labels that scholars and historians and journalists have kind of created over the years to try to understand this post-World War II merger of the South and the West, or maybe the South and the Southwest. A short answer is that it's this kind of merger of those two regions into something that's more understandable in a modern sense. The less satisfying answer is probably that the Sunbelt doesn't exist. It's an imagined creation to try to understand what we have is this movement away of the American South, the ex-Confederate South, past the World War II period, moving into more of a modern industrial age with sprawling metropolises, connecting in some similar ways to major cities in the American Southwest, and drawing some commonalities that previously hadn't necessarily existed, where you have a rural kind of plantation heritage South and a rugged frontier ranchland wild American West. But after World War II, those two sections of the country begin to develop economically in some interesting ways along the way with tremendous federal subsidization. You end up with kind of a connection of major American cities from San Diego, California, Los Angeles, especially suburban Los Angeles and Orange County, through places like Phoenix, Albuquerque, Dallas, Houston, Austin, San Antonio, moving through the South in major cities like Atlanta and younger cities like Tampa, Orlando, Jacksonville, and up to maybe Charlotte and a lot of other places in between, where the personality of these cities is suburban. It's very college educated, middle class, sprawling, and really kind of takes these two regions and morphs them into something that we've tried to understand as the Sunbelt. One of the things that we see as a result of World War II and the technologies that are produced as a result of World War II era, and then very critically, not just World War II, but the almost seamless transition from World War II to the potential for World War III and a Cold War with the Soviet Union. It had typically been tradition in the United States to go to war, mobilize an armed forces that is capable of winning that war, and then to demobilize and to try in some way, although the United States has never been fully isolationist, to attempt to maintain some sort of global neutrality. But the Cold War is a game changer, and so the United States, in perceiving the potential threat of especially a nuclear war with the Soviet Union after World War II, is the government needs to make sure that it's ready to wage and win that fight. And so in not demobilizing the 16 million people who are brought into the service to fight World War II, and then not really demobilizing that and feeling the need to maintain a much larger military presence, that means new defense bases that are federally funded. It means new research and development, such as the Manhattan Project that's based in Los Alamos and has in some ways a presence here in West Texas with Pantex up in Amarillo. And the weapons technology, the aerospace engineering, the employment that's necessary to staff these new training grounds, stretching all the way, like I said, from Texas across the arid southwestern deserts, New Mexico, Arizona, into naval bases, shipbuilding, aviation construction in Southern California. All of these jobs that require college education, especially STEM-oriented education, science, technology, engineering, math. This is radically transforming the landscape of what the South and the Southwest exists to provide the American people, but it's also radically transforming the need for colleges and universities and research universities, and relocating people from other parts of the country into the American Sunbelt. And you see this in the American South, in Florida and in Georgia and in North Carolina, and all the way across through Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, Nevada especially. You're going to see a lot of weapons testing in the Nevada deserts, for instance, and a lot of development that is, again, Cold War and post-World War II related. And so as as those states are growing economically, they're growing demographically. The population is growing. This means new housing construction. This means new highway construction, most of which is federally funded. So billions and billions of dollars of federal resources are being poured into the South and the Southwest to create this new development, defense-oriented society that is both fighting communism abroad and pursuing free market dreams at home. And it creates this kind of milieu in the American Southwest that just reinforces a lot of these ideas of just American ingenuity and hard work and a commitment to fighting. Well, conservatism in the Sun Belt has always been lingering in the background, and as I mentioned, with the concept of a Sun Belt at all is this fusion of the South and the West and the Southwest in some ways. And so if you look at the political history of the American South, certainly you can't escape race, you can't escape the legacy of slavery, of secession, of the Civil War. And so you certainly have lingering in the solidly conservative democratic South a sense of hostility toward Washington, D.C., a sense that states' rights and local control most of the time is advanced in the cause of racial segregation. But it's a useful rhetoric that can be employed in a variety of different ways when it comes to low taxes and the freedom of businesses to pursue their own interests and opposition to labor unions and right-to-work laws that develop in places like Texas in the early 1940s and then become national after 1947 or optional to national after about 1947 with the Taft-Hartley bill. So you have this anti-statism that's already pre-existing in the South, and you also have this kind of mythic American West of the frontier and American adventure and rugged individualism, and that the pioneering spirit of Americans who will pull themselves up by their bootstraps and make a way for themselves in the American West. And when something's not working at home, they can just kind of take their family and get away from the long arm of the federal government and move into the West and kind of establish a home for themselves. And they kind of equate this with freedom. And of course, all of this gets perpetuated and reinforced in Hollywood and the ideas of rugged individualism and freedom and the ability to control your own destiny. In terms of major moments for conservatism, and specifically Republican conservatism, because remember, we still have a lingering Democratic conservatism in the South, and that's actually going to be something that in various ways Sunbelt politicians like Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton will eventually be able to tap into and draw back some constituencies into the Democratic fold in the 70s and then in the 80s and 90s. But in terms of major moments where we see a developing Republican conservatism, certainly Reagan's election in 1966 as governor of California, John Towers' election in 1961, kind of fast forwarding to one of these other elements that really pushes the development of a traditionalist conservatism that blends together with kind of the anti-statist libertarianism is in the 1970s. Added to these political cultures is an evangelical thrust, kind of a renewal of family values politicized after, for instance, Roe versus Wade, 1973, which is a case that originates out of Dallas, Texas. And there's an accompanying case with that called Doe versus Bolton, I believe, that is out of Georgia. And so you have two Sunbelt states that are a part of that landmark case in 1973. And so the Supreme Court's sanction of abortion after 1973, mixed with decisions on school prayer, on tax-exempt status for private schools, which many of which have developed in the Sun Belt, especially after Brown versus Board of Ed in 1954, and you have the phenomenon of white flight, which adds to suburban development in the Sun Belt. I'd say that the development in the 1970s of a religious mobilization and the development of what Jerry Falwell will be a part of with the moral majority and just the broader Christian right, which historians have written about, through 76, when Jimmy Carter out of Georgia is the first national politician to really embrace the label of born-again Christian, and 76 becomes the so-called year of the evangelical. Now all of a sudden in 76, 77, 78, 79, and 80, politicians are really trying to attract what they see as a new demographic vote, which is the evangelical vote, which is also bringing in anti-communist Catholics out of the solidly Democratic column into more of a Reagan Democrat by 1980, an opportunity for the Republican Party to kind of remake the political landscape by fusing evangelicals with traditional Democratic voters in other parts of the country, urban Catholics, disaffected union workers who are struggling in the world of a post-industrial economy, which the Sun Belt is playing a big part of because of the lack of labor unions in most of the Sun Belt. So all of these things, it's not so much about major moments, although you can point to a few. I might add Bill Clement's election to the governorship of Texas in 1978, the first Republican to win the governor's seat in Texas since Reconstruction. There are these moments where you can see conservative Republican breakthroughs. Reagan's election to the presidency in 1980 as a Goldwater conservative wins a landslide election just 16 years after Barry Goldwater had been annihilated in the 1964 campaign by Texan Lyndon Johnson. You just see a radical transformation in a very short period of time, but there's no single moment. It's this perfect storm of social conservatism and evangelicalism and religious mobilization and the idea that scandal and corruption and Watergate and all of these things where the message of I trust my government and my government is competent and my government's not going to waste my money gets transformed by 1980 to Ronald Reagan. Government is not the solution to your problems. Government is the problem.
In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
What I hope people get from this book is, and one of the reasons why I wrote this book, is that historians and political scientists and journalists have been trying to study and understand political change, especially, what really has driven a lot of historiography in my field is this idea that Barry Goldwater gets crushed in the 1964 presidential election, losing to a liberal Texan who is running on a Great Society platform of bigger government and the fulfillment of the New Deal, and we trust our government, and government is good. And by 1980, Ronald Reagan, who begins his career as a Goldwater conservative, is winning just about as big of a landslide election in 1980 as Johnson wins in 1964. And how do we get from point A to point B? And so historians for 20 or 30 years have been trying to figure out the personalities, the locations, the issues. And what I really wanted to do in this book is take a step back and say that all of these historians are, in some ways, they're right. And they are looking at different facets of political change since World War II. They're all right, but they're not exclusively right. The story is really about all of these things together. But what I really hope is that people will be able to step back and see a big narrative of change over time. And I also really hope that what people see in this book is not an uninterrupted linear progression of conservative growth, because the Sun Belt really is a battleground region, and that's the subtitle of the book. The Sun Belt is a place of contestation. It's a very purple place, and it's becoming more purple as the years go by. It is most famous for the conservatives that come from the region, but there is a liberal persistence in the Sun Belt. The post-industrial metropolises, of other scholars have said, is really changing in the demographics of Texas and California and Arizona and Florida and Georgia, especially in these big cities. You're going to see increasingly, I think, the red Sun Belt becoming the battleground purple Sun Belt, and eventually I think in some places, even maybe in Texas in the next 10 to 15 years, becoming a blue state. It's a battleground region, and I think that we're not looking at a linear progression of conservatism so much as we are seeing change and dynamism and competition, and the Sun Belt is a microcosm of America in many ways, or it is America in many ways. And so you battle for these different constituencies across the Sun Belt states, but you're really battling for the heart and soul of the American future. And I think that people who read this book will see that it's contestation over a long period of time, and that it's not foreordained that this region is going to be a bastion of red conservative republicanism forever, nor has it necessarily been that way.